Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar tonight. My name is Rena Laughlin, and I am the Program Director for the Epilepsy Foundation, Eastern Pennsylvania. It is my pleasure to introduce all of you to a wonderful organization called AmbitCare. So tonight we are fortunate to have Elizabeth Rountree and Neha Kumar from AmbitCare talk with us about how there may be a genetic cause of your child's seizures and developmental delays, and how AmbitCare's free resources, including free virtual genetic counseling for qualified pediatric patients and one-to-one customized support, can help you find answers about the underlying cause of your child's epilepsy. Elizabeth Rountree is the COO and co-founder of AmbitCare and has over 25 years in life sciences and consulting services, and co-founded 2 highly successful health services startup companies. Neha Kumar is a genetic counselor and advisor at AmbitCare. She has a master's degree in genetic counseling from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and National Institutes of Health program. Her professional experience has been centered around bringing the power of genetic testing and genomic medicine to doctors and patients with the goal of delivering better, more personalized healthcare for families. So Elizabeth and Neha, thank you for being with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for letting us present and talk about AmbitCare today. We're really excited and looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to share some slides, and hopefully this will work smoothly. And I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Okay, super. So as Rena mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Rountree. I'm our Chief Operating Officer. And here's my other picture, so you can see 2 pictures of me. Really looking forward to speaking with all of y'all tonight. As Rena mentioned, my background is in life sciences, and before starting AmbitCare, I did a lot of work in life sciences consulting. And as a consultant, I really spent a lot of time talking to families, to patients, to their caregivers, and listening to stories of really long diagnosis times and challenges with accessing genetic testing and new therapies. And it really led me to believe that there was a better way to help families get access to services that they need to get their children an accurate and complete diagnosis. And so that was really the genesis of Ambit. And AmbitCares is trying to fill what I saw as a gap from talking to so many families. So we'll talk to you a little bit about some of the data, what genetic counseling and genetic testing is, and this will kind of build on, I think, a previous webinar that took place fairly recently, and then we'll talk to you a little bit about AmbitCare services. Neha, anything that you'd like to say before we get into some of the slides?
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Rena. And I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm a genetic counselor, and while I was in my training, I worked specifically in a pediatric genetics clinic and also on the NIH undiagnosed disease program, and really saw the journey that parents, families, children experience with trying to figure out why, and the benefit beyond just medical benefit that finding answers and the quest to find answers for them and how much that meant to them. So in my professional life, I've spent the last 10 years in various genetic testing organizations, really trying to figure out how we can take advantage of the new technologies and advancements in genetic testing to bring access to these diagnostic tools to families around the world. I'll let you take it from here, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Neha. So just a quick overview. We thought we'd start off telling a couple of stories of families that have been so generous to share their story with us. So we're excited to share them with you. We'll talk about some of those advancements that Neha was referring to in genetics and therapies, the importance of genetic testing specifically in epilepsy, and then talk about our services and have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have a great time for Q&A later on in our discussion. So Isabella's parents really were worried about Isabella, and they kind of mentioned their concerns to their pediatrician, and their pediatrician kind of reassured them that everything was fine. You know, different kids develop at different rates, but still they just felt that there was something not quite right. And so they really pushed to continue trying to find answers, and eventually did get genetic testing and found out that Isabella has Rett syndrome. And you know, their family, when we were talking to them, mentioned that they saw 3 different pediatricians before she was a year old. And you know, it wasn't an easy journey, because when a doctor tells you, you know, don't worry about it, I mean, they are the experts. But one of the challenges in the conditions that we'll be talking about today is that they're rare. And many of you may have heard a statistic before that there are 7,000 rare diseases, and they're not very, because they're rare. You know, many physicians may never see any of these conditions, or may see one patient with a diagnosis in their whole career. And so it makes it very challenging for physicians to kind of put the pieces together and kind of help build that puzzle of what might be going on, just because they will have potentially never seen this condition before. And as we'll talk about in a little while, that's where genetic testing can really come into play. Our next patient case is Maui. Maui has tuberous sclerosis complex, and he actually developed some symptoms that were not related to his epilepsy. He ended up having some kind of lesions and symptoms on his skin, which caused his parents to take him to a dermatologist. And the dermatologist was at a major kind of academic medical center and said, you know, I think that there might be kind of an underlying genetic cause of this condition, and we would like for you to take Maui for some additional testing. And he had some cardiac testing, and they recommended genetic testing, and the family struggled with the decision. You know, they saw this genetic testing as having pros and cons, and Neha will talk about that in just a minute. There, you know, just like any kind of medical procedure, there are risks and benefits. And at this point in time, Maui, when he was a baby, was developing normally. He was hitting all of his milestones, and they're like, other than kind of this skin lesion, everything seemed right on track. But they did decide to move forward with genetic testing, and now they're very glad that they did, because Maui did get a diagnosis, and understanding what the underlying genetic drivers were of Maui's disease made it a lot easier for the family to understand kind of what might be coming. They were able to make sure that Maui got the right treatment and was receiving the right therapies, that the right specialists that really focused on his condition. And so they're also able to connect to resources, you know, support groups, you know, advocacy groups specific to tuberous sclerosis that provided a lot of resources so that they could plan for Maui's future. So I think it was a really difficult decision for them, but one that in retrospect, they're really glad that they made. And so kind of these 2 patients show you just a quick view of some of the benefits and some of the challenges associated with genetic testing, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. You know, Neha mentioned some of the advances, and this is a incredibly rapidly changing area of medicine. Just a couple of statistics. I love statistics, not everybody might, but a few. In a 3-year, from 2017 to 2020, so I guess 4-year time period, over 50 new epilepsy genes were discovered, and new genes are discovered all the time. I mean, it's not an uncommon situation for a new gene to be identified, or an existing gene to be classified as a gene that's associated with epilepsy. Based on a number of different studies, the data would indicate that about 30% of people with epilepsy actually have an underlying genetic cause. And you know, you don't know if someone has an underlying genetic cause unless you get testing. So it's one of those, until you test, you can't tell from looking at someone if they have a genetic epilepsy. And there are 52 drugs in development for seizure disorders, and many of these drugs in development are targeted to specific genetic findings. And so if you don't have a genetic diagnosis, you're not going to be eligible for these new therapies in development. So kind of another statistic that we'll talk a little bit more about later, kind of supports the idea, at least, that genetic testing is something that is meaningful. One of the quote at the bottom is talking about retesting. So one of the services that we offer is we do help families who maybe were tested. If you think about 50 genes developed in 2017 to 2020, so someone who was tested in 2017, 2015, 2019 easily could have been tested and nothing found. But if that person was retested today, there could be some significant genetic findings that would warrant knowing about. So because science is evolving so fast, the idea of retesting or reanalyzing existing test results is actually really, really an important point, and we'll talk about that later as well. So even though there are many reasons to get tested, one of the things that we've seen in creating Ambit and building our AmbitCare platform is that many families are still struggling to find answers. On average, it takes 6 to 7 years for a child to get a diagnosis in childhood seizure disorders, which is one of the areas that we're focused on. And that's a long time. That's a really long journey for families to go on, to feel like there's something more. There's some answers to questions that they have, and they can't get those answers. And about, from the data that we've looked at, about more than half of people who have epilepsy don't know if there's an underlying cause of their disease. And some of the numbers from the EFEPA website would suggest that many patients don't have full control over their epilepsy, and sometimes that can be because there is a genetic cause that isn't being fully managed. So genetic testing can help, and we'll talk more about that. So Neha, I'll turn this over to you to talk a little bit about genetic counseling and genetic testing.
Great. So taking a step back from everything that Elizabeth just talked about, let's start by defining what is genetic counseling, what is genetic testing. Genetic counselors are really partners that work through the genetic testing process with families. They are masters trained healthcare providers who support families specifically seeking more information about genetic causes of disease and how it might impact them or their families. Genetic counselors typically start by gathering and assessing your unique medical and family history. So drawing out your family history pedigree and understanding what the medical history has been for different members of the family. Based on that analysis and assessment, they may order genetic tests or talk about specific different genetic testing options that exist and what you might find from them, what you won't find from them. And once you've had genetic testing, genetic counselors can also work with you to interpret the results and get you connected to the right specialist, the right resources to navigate the implications of those genetic tests. One of the most important focus areas for genetic counselors is also thinking about, what does this now mean for the future of my family in terms of, will this happen again if I choose to have additional children? Or if my child chooses to have children, what are the implications for them? So that's often where genetic counselors can get really involved. Genetic testing now looks for specific changes, which are called variants in your DNA, your genetic material, that might be associated with the disease or the symptoms that the child has been experiencing. So the results of genetic tests can confirm a suspected condition or figure out whether there's a chance that you might develop it or a chance that you might pass it on, going back to what we were just talking about. It's completely non-invasive. It can be, so it can be done through a cheek swab or a saliva sample, or it can be a blood sample as well. And most laboratories that will do genetic testing are able to accept different types of samples to provide that analysis. There are many different types of genetic tests, and not all genetic tests are the same, and even the same test ordered from a different laboratory is not necessarily always the same. So it is important to understand what exact testing you've had, that you're being offered, and what other options might exist. Because one test doesn't necessarily, at this point at least, look for every possible thing. So there are tests called chromosomal microarrays that are looking for deletions or duplications of chromosomes and or parts of chromosomes. They're gene panels that are looking for variants within specific genes that are associated with epilepsy, or there is more comprehensive analysis like a whole exome or whole genome test, which is looking really at everything that we can and we know to look at. The results of the test may indicate the presence or an absence of disease-causing variants, or it may be ambiguous. And this is really something that is important to understand, that it may come back that we actually don't know, because there's only so much we know about genetics. And Elizabeth was talking about these advancements are ongoing. So maybe today we don't know, but tomorrow we might find out something more as more and more people get tested. So typically, if there is a negative or an ambiguous result, additional testing may be indicated. So say sometimes doctors will start with a chromosomal microarray. At that point, if that result is negative, they may move on to a gene panel or an exome sequencing test. And that might be one approach that could be considered. But even if the genetic testing result is negative or ambiguous, there's also the idea that there's this advancements happening in genetics. So it may be in a couple of years, you again get retested, going back to this patient story we were just talking about. So why is it important to get genetic testing? We've been through some of the reasons through those stories already, but one of the most important things I think is for epilepsy can really have an impact on the treatment and medical care. So based on a genetic testing result, you might learn that it might be beneficial to avoid, stop, or initiate a specific anti-seizure medication, or change diet, or make plans or stop plans for specific surgeries. For example, for children or individuals with Dravet syndrome, certain medications can really worsen symptoms. So now genetic testing can help you figure that out and make sure that you don't go on those medications. Genetic testing can also impact the course of disease. So knowing the results early, for example, in patients with CLN2, can help patients get earlier access to treatment that may limit their regression. Additionally, with all the advancements happening on the pharmaceutical side, genetic testing can also help patients get access to clinical trials or newer types of treatment that might require that confirmed genetic diagnosis. And then additionally, genetic testing can help you prepare for the future. So for Maui, this was really important for his family, knowing what to expect, making sure that you're going to the right specialist, being appropriately monitored for all the other possible symptoms that might end up manifesting as a result of that genetic diagnosis. And I think for a lot of families, this really can't be understated, is just genetic testing and getting that diagnosis, or even knowing that you've tried, can really present some closure for that diagnostic odyssey that families go through, and also help you stop going through more additional tests, more procedures, more time, more energy, more money, trying to find that answer. And then additionally, as we were just talking about, genetic testing can also be really important for family planning. So for epilepsies and genetic epilepsies particularly, many of them are actually not inherited, and many of them occur due to new variation that occurs as a baby is being developed. So there is typically a much lower risk of being able to pass it on to a future child. And finding that out can be really important for some families. One parent told us that this really helped her stopped her from blaming herself for what happened to her child, and she felt comfortable now having more children. The other place that genetic testing can really help is also in getting access to additional, more specific resources to communities, and figuring out how to navigate state, school, other resources that can help your child achieve the best possible outcomes.
Well, thank you, Neha. So now that we've spent some time talking about kind of why you might want to consider genetic counseling and testing, we thought we would tell you a little bit about the services that AmbitCare provides. So we're really dedicated to helping families find the underlying cause of your loved one's symptoms. And we think it's really important for families to be the ones who make a decision about whether genetic counseling and testing is right for you. And so in order for you to make that decision, you need to know that genetic counseling and testing is an option and could be warranted if your child is having seizures. Some of the other elements about our service, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is that we are really committed to helping families that have barriers to care. And all of our services are free, and we try to make them as accessible as possible. I mean, we're a fairly young company, but we do have services in English and Spanish, and hope to bring on additional languages in the future. And all of our services are available, from the comfort of your own home. So you don't have to travel and go anywhere. You don't have to take time off work. Appointments are available in the evening and on the weekends. And certainly the no cost element also helps make them accessible, because a lot of times families, when they've been on this long diagnostic odyssey, do have a lot of resources, time and money that's been invested in testing and travel and seeing specialists. And so we wanted to make our services as no impact on the budget and as little impact on families' time as possible. And what we're really trying to do here is to reduce the time it takes to get a complete diagnosis. And on your loved one's journey, they certainly have gotten diagnoses, and they're not wrong diagnoses. You can have a diagnosis of epilepsy, but also have a rare genetic condition. They're not mutually exclusive. So, we're really trying to help families kind of finish that diagnostic journey, really understand what the cause is. And by getting genetic testing, as Neha mentioned, everyone who gets tested means that the community overall is learning and finding more causes and finding more potential drivers of disease that can be targeted with new treatments and new treatment modalities. So kind of all of this work that we're doing in genetic testing, and that all of you are doing who agree to be tested, is really accelerating research in rare childhood seizure disorders. So we have a website called AmbitCare.com, and it provides free support for diagnosis and beyond. So just a quick overview of some of our services. So we have free genetic counseling and testing. So it's a very convenient process to access. As I mentioned, you can log into the website, you can call us, you can do it on your mobile phone, and you go on and you answer a few questions to see if you're eligible, and we'll talk about who's eligible. Once you're eligible, then our AmbitCare ambassadors can kind of hook you up with genetic counseling, genetic testing, other resources that you need. And so your AmbitCare ambassador really becomes your one-on-one support and resource to help you kind of on your journey and make sure that you know what the next step is, and hopefully make everything in the process moving forward as clear as possible. This slide provides a kind of an overview of our genetic counseling and testing services. So, there's that first step of registering. And then once you register, one of the things that we think is really important, and it goes along with that sort of, you're the ones that need to be making the decision about whether genetic testing is right for you. And to make that decision, we really think, as Neha mentioned, genetic counselors are just a critical part of the journey. They're the ones that can really answer any questions, explain what the different testing options are, talk about risk and benefit, talk about how long it's going to take to get the test results back, what kind of results, what might they look like, how do you interpret them? I mean, that's a really, really important conversation to have before any kind of genetic testing is done. And so our kind of pre-test genetic counseling, can be done at home. It can be done over the phone, over a Zoom meeting like this, if you like seeing people face to face. It even can be done via chat, which isn't my favorite modality, because I think maybe I'm just a little old school, but I think a conversation, I feel like I get more information from a conversation than chatting back and forth. But I know families are super, super busy, so chat is absolutely an option available. So After the genetic counseling is done, the genetic counselor says, based on the information that you provided, here's the type of genetic testing that would be warranted, kind of based on your child's symptoms, family history, and also the science and literature of what we know today. And then they order, if you're interested and want to move forward with genetic testing, then the genetic counselor makes arrangements to get the genetic testing ordered. And the genetic testing the test kit just comes to you in the mail. And as Neha mentioned, it's usually, saliva or a swab in your mouth. I feel like with COVID, we have all become experts in swabbing. So just use your swabbing or spitting skills. And, you open up the box, you collect the sample from your child, you close up the box, and it's got, postage paid on it, and you take it and ship it back. And once it gets sent back to the lab, depending on the type of test, because as Neha mentioned, there's quite a wide variety of different tests. The results can come back in 2 weeks to 6 weeks. That's typical range. I think potentially could be a little bit longer, and that time clock kind of starts once the test results go back to the lab. So if the box gets lost in the house for a while and doesn't get shipped to the lab, that'll certainly delay the overall turnaround time. But once it gets to the lab, they get on it right away. The next step in the process is the post-test genetic counseling, also a really, really critical part of the step. We've actually, and I was actually quite surprised by this, but we've had a number of families come to us who have already had genetic counseling, already had genetic testing. And they've come to us and say, I had this genetic testing and I got this report, but nobody has walked me through it and I don't know what it means. And, these are, imagine these are your genes, like these are very kind of complex reports that can be difficult to interpret and understand. And so we feel like this post-test genetic counseling is critically important. Whether you go through testing with us or if you already have test results, if you have questions about those results, we're happy to provide free post-test counseling because it's just really important for you to understand. And I think also we've heard from families that sometimes it takes more than one post-test counseling visit because especially if you have kind of a positive finding that suggests a genetic condition, that's a very momentous time. And you may not remember the 30-minute conversation about the test results and what they mean. You may remember, this diagnosis. And so, being able to go back, have another discussion with your genetic counselor, send them questions via chat, kind of all of that's available through our platform because it's really important that you feel comfortable with the results of the genetic test and understand the findings and the implications and what the next steps are. And one of the last step is, it's not really a step, it's more of an ongoing degree of support is, we're here as AmbitCare to help provide you with additional resources. And those can be additional resources around genetic disease that you've been diagnosed with, or information on different kind of centers of excellence for that condition, or physicians that have expertise in treating that physician, or as Neha mentioned, clinical trials that you might be eligible for, or in some cases, approved therapies that are indicated for that condition. And so all of those types of resources, connections to patient organizations and local resources that can help you kind of with your next steps. And so all of that is kind of what the AmbitCare ambassador provides and continues to provide on an ongoing basis as long as you need us, we are here. This process that we're walking through is really driven by you. It's your decision to want to learn more. It's your decision to want to talk to a genetic counselor. It's your decision to decide to get genetic testing. And all of our services are free of charge. We do think it's really, really important for your physician to be involved and part of the journey. And if you consent, again, your decision, but if you consent, then we do share the genetic counseling notes, the testing results to your physician. Your genetic counselor is also available to answer any questions that your physician has about the diagnoses. You know, as I mentioned earlier, some of these physicians may be like, I've never heard of this condition before. I really don't know anything about it. And you can imagine, like, as a physician who spent years in medical school, that can be a very uncomfortable position for them to be in. So they, you know, want to get education and want to understand what's going on and learn more about your condition as well. So we really highly encourage families to let us, you know, provide that service to their doctors so that they can be kind of part of the care team and engaged and understand what appropriate next steps might be. Neha, any points to add here?
No, this was great. I think I certainly agree that keeping your physician involved is really important. And, you know, I think the great thing about working through a service like AmbitCare is also that we're there to advocate for you through all of these and help you in many different ways to get access to, you know, figure out all of the things that can go wrong at each of these steps. We're here to on your side to make sure that we can make those right and get you to the next step.
So if your tests get, I don't know about you guys, but my mail service delivery is not what it was a couple years ago. So if your test kit gets lost in the mail or anything that happens, we're here to help resolve it and get it fixed, and hopefully not require much of your time other than just letting us know that there's a challenge that you're facing. So just to summarize sort of the benefits of AmbitCare services is, you know, we aim to make the genetic testing process easier, more accessible. Our services are free, they're fast, they're done at home. And, you know, we're really trying to create a very seamless experience. We know how busy you are, you know, caring for your family and everything else that you have on your plate. You know, helping your child who has epilepsy, there's probably a lot going on at home. And so we want to make this as easy as possible for families so that they can, you know, decide whether this is the right next step for them. And if it is, you know, make sure that they are able to make it all the way through the genetic testing process. So if you're interested and want to find out if you qualify for our free services, ambitcare.com is the website, and we'll actually, I think one of our colleagues will put this registration link into the website or into the chat here, and that way if you have any interest, you can go to the website, you can learn more about us, you can register, and our contact information will also be in the chat in case you have any questions. We're happy to answer them at any time, and always happy to chat and be a resource about our services. And so we would love to open it up for questions.
So far, I don't see any questions in chat, but yes, please put your questions and we will present them.
Rena, did any questions come to mind for you as you were hearing us walk through these slides?
You know, we get people asking, like adults asking if they should get some genetic testing done. So what would you say about that for adults wondering about that?
That's a great question. I'll turn that over to Neha as our true expert here.
Yeah, I think, you know, some of the recent studies that have been done certainly suggest a lot of value in still having the adults tested, because again, as more and more of these new treatments and trials come out, you know, adults may experience over their lifetime any changes in symptoms, change, you know, again, knowing what might be there in the future, thinking about having families, et cetera. This information can really help them still and get them access to more appropriate treatments, get them into trials that might really help them and change the course of their disease, and also figure out what the implications are for their family broadly. So I certainly think there is still tremendous value no matter how old you are.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Our criteria, so for children that are under 8, basically any child under 8 who's had 1 or more seizures would qualify for all of our free services. And then for anyone 8 and older, and there's no age limit, it can be, we just had somebody come through yesterday who was 46. So any age range, it's 2 or more seizures. And then, usually the folks that get the most benefit from genetic testing in that older group may have another kind of concomitant diagnosis. There could be a concomitant diagnosis, could be autism, cerebral palsy, a developmental delay, a bunch of other kind of characteristics might be associated with an increased probability of having a genetic finding on their testing. But really from our perspective, we're happy to help, basically anybody 8 and older who's had 2 or more seizures.
Wonderful, thank you. A question that I have, so if a person does have an underlying genetic cause to their epilepsy, does that mean that they've had that ever since birth, or can your genes kind of lie kind of quiet and dormant, and then something triggers it, and then there's a problem? Like, are you born with a genetic issue, or can you develop it later on in life?
So typically when we think about these rare diseases, it is something that you have in your genetic material, which is the same material you're born with. So that material doesn't change per se over your lifetime. But what we see a lot with genetic conditions is that between person X and person Y, when that genetic material actually starts leading to symptoms or actually start impacting their life, can really vary for some conditions. Mm-hmm. So some people go on to develop, such and such frequent seizures. Some people don't until they're much older. It's highly variable, and there's just some of those things that we simply don't understand. Most likely there are other genes, other factors, environmental triggers, even perhaps, that are involved that all have to come together a certain way, but we haven't quite mastered the art of predicting all of that.
That makes sense. Thank you.
One of the things that I think is, really interesting, and Neha, you mentioned this earlier when you were talking about kind of some of those reasons for genetic testing, including family planning. In these rare seizure disorders, as you mentioned, most of these conditions are de novo. So we've definitely talked to families and they've said, well, we don't have epilepsy in our family. Like, there's probably not a genetic cause of the epilepsy because of that. And here, it's interesting because a lot of these, it isn't that the family passed on a gene, it's that this was a brand new change in the gene that happened, Neha, as you were saying, when the baby was being made, to use a non-technical phrase.
Yes, it is definitely something unique that is for the genetic epilepsies, which changes how we counsel families about family planning options. It really reduces the risk that it could happen again. It doesn't quite eliminate it because technically that change may be in the egg cell or the sperm cell that exists in the parent's body, and still, it may be all of them, it may be some of them. So there's a lot of investigation that can go into trying to figure that out potentially, but oftentimes it's just, there's a reduced risk, but it's not, we never say net zero in genetics.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So if someone reaches out to you and, say they do get diagnosed with a rare genetic type of epilepsy, will you also connect them with different organizations that provide support services to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, if there is one. So Many times there are organizations that are kind of patient advocacy organizations that are dedicated to kind of building a community amongst folks that have that diagnosis and advocating for resources and investment in research for that organization, providing support services. But it does happen where folks get a diagnosis and they could be like the 20th person in the world that has this diagnosis, and there might not yet be an organization, a support group that's specifically for that condition. And in that case, there are kind of more general organizations, like there's an organization that's for rare epilepsies that can be really valuable, even if there isn't one for that specific condition. And in a lot of cases, those early family members who get the first diagnosis or the 20th diagnosis often become kind of part of the community and create a community. We see it pretty commonly where maybe first there's a Facebook group that's set up by one of those early families, and then that becomes, and grows into more and more, so that eventually there are resources available for everyone that has that diagnosis. But we are really dedicated to help filling in those gaps and supporting the development of communities, especially around new and emerging genetic diseases.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I don't see any questions in chat, and I'm looking on our Facebook chat as well. I don't see any questions there. So I just wanted to thank you, Elizabeth and Neha, for that wonderful presentation. We hope all of you out there enjoyed the session as well. I will email everyone the recording link in case you'd like to watch again or want to share it with your family and friends or anyone that you think might be interested. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Rena, for letting us present and talk.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.